Hello, we're back in the autonomy perception module for Robotaxi project. And what we're going to do today is we're going to look at a little bit of how Saphira generates hazardous scenarios and downstream artifacts for a 21448 SOTIF safety case. So we have our typical workflow here where we have selected a component from the asset library that is one of the systems, a top-level system, for example, perception system for autonomous vehicle, as the focus element for this particular analysis. And as you know, in SOTIF, since you're evaluating a function, you care a little bit less about the system under consideration and more about the function under consideration. So the function we're going to consider is detect and classify objects for automated steering, while the system that implements that function is a perception system for an autonomous vehicle, which has the rest of its components encoded in this project. So that way, when we go through and we generate functional scenarios and then use that to produce the hazardous scenarios down below, we end up having some useful inputs. So the first thing I'm going to do, just as a demonstration, is indicate how we would go about completing the item definition for everything downstream. Again, typically this is the kind of thing we want to import, but if, for example, you don't have this up front, this is the kind of thing that we can generate from other artifacts you provided. So, for example, you may have uploaded some documentation in the context store, or otherwise defined it in elsewhere, maybe the architecture diagram for this particular item. So we can just hit generate to produce those functional scenarios. And I'll pause while that generates. And here we are. We have the system item definition. We have some system overview that was produced, primary functionality, and then down below we have the part that we really care about, just the functional scenarios like pedestrian detection, dynamic obstacle avoidance on highways, low-speed navigation, parking lots, system redundancy and fault detection, etc. Cool. So that'll now get used, and we can scroll all the way down to this section and generate the FUSA workflow, which starts by creating these hazardous scenarios. So this is all that I wanted to present for today, just showing you a little bit of what we do in the SOTIF scenario. So the idea is our main goal is to identify those key hazardous scenarios. And in this particular case, we do so in the context of just the upstream definition. So all we define is, for example, rolling shutter distortion and high-ego scene motion. So a hypothetical scene that is risk rated that we can then use to produce our downstream HARA. And we define the affected function. So AV that collects PII for safety critical steering decisions. This was one of the functions defined up above. We have a detection method for this particular hazardous scenario, a failure mode that defines this scenario, and a potential cause. And these are all the key items that we end up using down below when we generate the SOTIF-oriented HARA. This one hasn't yet been updated, but if you were to come in here and do the same thing here, that's what you would get. So the idea here is that, for example, if you're using Saphira to evaluate a SOTIF case that an external vendor has produced, what you can do is you can input a bunch of these details, then use this to trace whether we believe, based on your rules, that the HARA that they have designed to is in fact complete. Now that gives you a good rating of whether or not they did a good job of evaluating the hazardous scenarios. It helps you, for example, align to the sort of hazardous scenarios you want to consider using your ontology. And we'll present a lot more in the coming weeks about how exactly we build up those ontologies and use them in this scenario. So that's us for now. Thanks.